So in this video, we're making recycled skateboard chef's knives. Just like any other project from recycled skateboards, the first step is to laminate all the skateboards together into a big block. Here you see me unpacking all the knives from Katsura and putting blue tape on the blades. This is because these knives are made from really high quality Japanese Damascus steel, so it's important to protect the blade throughout all the sanding and shaping process. I like to use blue tape for this step because you can get it fairly inexpensive in large quantities, and it doesn't leave any residue when you take it off, and it's also great for protecting from the epoxy, which is a later step. But I also add a secondary layer when it comes time for that. So once I've taped up all the blades, the next step is to figure out how thick all the knife scales need to be. To do this, I take out my indexable square from Woodpecker Tools, and I measure it up to the blade and the stock. And then from there, I go to the table saw and I set the width of the fence from the blade to that plus about a 1/16 so I can allow for some sanding. Once I've gotten the table saw set to how I like, I begin cutting the knife scales. So the next step is to trace the knife handle on all the knife scales. So this is really simple. Once you have all the colors lined up and everything dialed in, you just lay the blade down and you trace it. Once I've gotten all the knife scales traced with the outline of the knife handles, I move over to the bandsaw. I lower the bandsaw blade down to be just above the knife scale height. And here is a step that I'm not showing but I need to discuss, is that on all the knife scales, I use double-sided tape to stick them together. This ensures that they're both the same shape to just minimize sanding and to keep the colors in line. So once I've gotten all the knife scales rough cut at the bandsaw, it's time to drill the holes for the knife pins. So I move over to the drill press once I've marked all the knife scales, and then I drill them. And then I use a 2-part 5-minute epoxy to secure the knife scales to the handle blades. So I just mix it with a popsicle stick on a scrap piece of plywood and then apply it using the same popsicle stick onto the blades themselves. Once I've applied the epoxy onto the blade itself, I lay out the knife scales and then I'm using brass pins to keep them in place. So I tap them in using a little ball peen hammer, and then once they're in place, I secure them with clamps. Once all the handles are secured and the epoxy is dried, I move over to the belt sander and I begin to remove the excess material down to the metal blade. So I find that the curvature on this particular belt sander works great for this shape of knife, but I do have to alternate between different sanders to get it all done. So once I've gotten them all sanded down to the blade, I move over to the router table to add the roundovers. So by doing this, I'm using a 3/8 inch radius roundover bit, and I'm just tracing the blade itself. In one of my previous videos, you can see me repairing a knife that suffered from some tear out at the router table. This is that knife, and you can see here where the tear out happens. So once I've finished over up at the router table, I move over to the mini belt sander where I clean up the part that the router couldn't get. And then I'm actually shaping the entire knife sharpener handle on this. I did it kind of a different style, but I really love the way it came out. So once I've gotten them all sanded, I move over to the epoxy finishing process. And the first step here is to tape up all of the metal, so that's what you're seeing me do. I'm adding another layer of blue tape, and I'm really taking my time making sure to not go over the line for where the metal meets the wood. This is really important to keep the epoxy where you want it. So next, I use a 2-part epoxy to finish the handles. Here you see me measuring out equal parts using a scale. And then from there, you just mix it really well and make sure that all of the little white lines go away and it's perfectly clear. Once the epoxy is properly mixed, I move to apply it with a sponge brush. For the first coat, I do it really thin and often put a little more than I need and then wipe it off. And that's what I'm doing on all of them here. So what I'm not going to show you in this video is the second coat. So once the first coat's done, I come back the next day and I apply a second coat, but much thicker. So once I've applied the epoxy on all the knife handles, I come through with a blowtorch to remove the air bubbles. And what this does is it makes the epoxy slightly more viscous by heating it up, which allows the air bubbles to escape to the surface and then pop. Once the epoxy is cured, I remove the tape, and then I use steel wool to slightly buff the metal and get it to a nice sheen. And that's my knives from Katsura Knives and Barousse Works. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for the next video.